Hey everybody. All right, we're going to go ahead and share my screen. So we're going to talk about Transgeneration, the Ann Travers book, but we're going to talk about specifically chapter 1 in this lecture. And we're going to talk about first we're going to get to some quotes, and I want to talk about them first. And then we're going to get to specifically kind of geared towards this overarching idea of what the life of trans kids looks like. Again, it is not a homogenous story, so breaking it down into homogenizing ways is not something I intend to do. However, understanding that there are pieces of the puzzle that are more statistically, sorry y'all, it's late, statistically probable for trans kid, especially when it comes to situations of violence, is something that we need to have really start conversations about. So first, I'm going to get into some of these quotes right quick. So first of all, some of the artwork that I put on here, I put Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Riviera on here specifically because they are the trans foremothers that we have that started the essentially the LGBTQ widespread movement through their acts in the Stonewall in the original Stonewall engagement. So you can look more into them. They're amazing. The artist here is Micah Van Zandt. And so I also would offer that you should look more into that person as well, because their artwork is beautiful. But I did put them on here specifically because I feel as though they are impactful in ways that we should hear more about. So the first one, I want to just kind of read this real quick. It says that Stryker and I'm not going to pronounce that right, and I apologize, pointedly define gender as a biopolitical apparatus that operates on all bodies to produce unequal distribution of life chances. Gender privileges not only just men over women, but also legibly or functionally gendered over those who become inhuman waste due to their incoherent, messy or ambiguous relationship to biopolitical unity. So really what they're talking about here is this idea that of biology as political, right? So, and we have these conversations more when we talk about disability studies, but I don't get into that as much in this class. But really when we talk about biology as political, we talk about the ways in which a trans person experiences gender in a very political way, mostly because of the policies and procedures that are systemically put in place that discredits their own self-identity within the gender binary, but also outside of the gender binary, we have non-binary folks who specifically, because they fall outside of that two-system ideology, are used as political warfare, and political warfare is waged specifically against them. So really understanding that as a body, we are also a political entity. And when it comes to bodies who do differentiate or delineate from the norms or expectations of society, then you have even more attention drawn on to that in very political ways. So really just having and understanding how those things are used against people and justifications for inhumane treatment and violence, and specifically othering those people to the point in which they no longer are treated as human really is kind of the point here. And then the last one is really just talking about the ways in which we talk about children and through children, and without really engaging with the fact that they are humans as well, with their own minds, brains, ideas about themselves, ideas about the world, and their own set of lived experiences that shape and mold who and how they are. And they talk about this in the way of the experiences of children who are understood as not yet fully human are rendered less real, their feelings and desires less important, and their capacity for agency limited at best. And I think, a prime example of this is really talking through the ways in which we problem solve any kind of domestic situation or any kind of social welfare. So I know that we have a lot of social workers going into this, and really one of the main tenets of our social welfare system, especially when it talks about like DHS or child welfare system specifically, is we talk in terms of parental rights to be able to be around the child, to garner their own rights, to parent back, to we talk about this in the ways of gearing towards family reunification, sometimes through and at the expense of the wishes of the child. And I think that that's interesting to watch how we gear that in the ways in which we don't necessarily adhere to, or we render less real, as this quote talks about, the feelings and desires of those children. On the flip side of that, understanding the capacity to understand complex situations comes with age. So prioritizing and having conversations about where we are in that, and specifically developmentally, the capacity for doing or understanding the full complexities of every given situation is part of understanding the roles of children in society, right? So like my kid is a prime example. My kid is very opinionated and has learned their own voice at a very, very young age. And they got mad because bedtime was bedtime and decided to write their own Bill of Rights, essentially, for children's rights, and tried to get it passed as an amendment. And so my child has decided to start a child's rights movement because they did not want to go to bedtime and they feel they have the right to do so, to not do so, which I explained to them. They do have the right to not do so. That comes with consequences, as do any other action any adult or anyone otherwise does. So, but again, understanding that while my child is 9 and incapable of going and living by themselves and making all their own decisions, understanding that having conversations about the difference between being able to make a decision and having rules around them doesn't go away when you're an adult as well, is something that my child needed in that particular moment. So really understanding how experiences of children shape and knowing that they understand a lot about their little worlds and understand a lot about what they want and don't want, really will help kind of walk through the rest of this text. And so at that, the lives of trans kids are increasingly different than those who fall under the specific binary operating and those who are cis, so, and appear as cis, especially. So trans kids are much more likely to be bullied. They are much more likely to suffer from suicide or self-harm. They are much more likely to experience homelessness, which we talked about in a previous lecture. They're much more likely to experience violence. They're much more likely to experience a multitudes of instabilities around family, around support structures, around a lot of situations. Now, there's a lot of data that backs when support structures are in place for trans kids. Trans kids tend to have those negative outcomes tend to level off towards much closer to the averages of cis kids, but really understanding that the negative outcomes are tangible and tend to increase with lack of support will help kind of frame some of these conversations. And so really, this chapter really touched on the different coping strategies that trans kids that Ann Travers interviewed expressed. There are ways to handle all of the undue pressure of their own identity, of their situation, the way it situates within society, and the negative outcomes that can come from those situations. Okay. So I'm going to quickly roll through those. They talked about invisibility, just that idea of I'm not going to make myself visibly trans or make myself out in invisible ways as to not draw attention to myself in the way of negative harms. They talked about making it work. So, and sucking it up, kind of this idea that I understand that in my current situation that it is not safe to be this way, and so, or to be myself, not this way because it's not a way they're being, but to be myself. And so in order to make it, I'm going to either make and push what boundaries I can push, but I'm not going to do so in a way that pushes a limit that might give me this negative harms, right? We also talk about the double life. So having in places that I have supported or that it is possible for me to be out and or express myself in these ways, I'm going to do so. And in the places that it is unsafe for me to do so, I am not going to, and allowing myself the ability to meld back and forth when necessary, to keep myself from having a multitudes of harms coming from every direction. Self-harm and suicide. And again, while we talk through these, understand that not all coping strategies are healthiest or something that I would want for our trans youth, and not something that we advocate for. So while we talk about self-harm and suicide being part of the series of coping strategies that these students and these kids face or utilize, it's not something that they do lightly. It's not something that they feel is light, but it's also not something that we can choose to ignore or not acknowledge as part of the list of coping strategies that these kids utilize. So non-conformity. And this kind of also ties into that branching from the binary. So really having conversations about more broadly about how they are pushing limits and changing ideas by choosing not to conform to these binary structures, choosing not to conform to these ideas of their expectations that are pushing against them, choosing not to conform to these negative policies. And in some of this, they have parents that back them, and some in these situations they don't, right? So some of this non-conformity and some of this branching out from the binary really is geared into not just their interactions within schools or their interactions in social places, but also within their interactions in their home. And so really understanding that, pushing these, and really thinking through why specific colors have to be geared towards specific genders, or why specific types of clothing have to be geared towards, or haircuts or what have you have to be geared towards this thing, pushing back on those ideologies and those implications really have been a useful coping skill and a coping strategy in allowing themselves the space for expression. Transitioning is, and again, when we talk transitioning, we're not just talking about surgical, we're not just talking about medical in general. Transitioning can be name changes, can be the pronouns you use, can be the social context you want to operate in, the ways in which you want to be referred to, the clubs you want to be in, the groups you want to be a part of. Transitioning doesn't necessarily just have to be something that's related to hormone therapies or surgical interventions or any kind of medical tools. Now, there are those options as well. And the book talks about specifically hormone therapy for some of the older youth, but also talking about the hormone blockers for some of the younger youth. And again, you can get into some of that not only in this book, but also Contesting Intersex also talks about hormone blockers and their safety. And how safe they are to use for individuals, but also how much good can come out of those. So as you get older and as you want to look into more of these, this book does an amazing amount of thing, and there's an entire chapter that really dives into supportive healthcare. And so if you're going into any of those kinds of jobs, I would love to assign every chapter of this book, but unfortunately you guys only have a limited amount of time, and I'm aware of that. So now that you have the book, I hope that you move into looking into some of those other chapters as well. And then lastly, kind of engaging in that social change, being parts of movements, being parts of social change, even in their own little world, whether it be through creating new ideas within their family structures, whether it be advocating for themselves, whether it be advocating for others, whether it be being parts of groups of advocacy, being parts of movements for advocacy. No matter what level they're doing, that level and that ability to be part of social change or feel as though they're making social change was a distinct characteristic of and a distinct coping strategy used by these kids. So again, as always, we're going to talk about this from an intersectional lens. So really talking through the ways in which class and race and disability and all of these things shape what options you have for coping strategies and what options you have within those coping strategies, right? So even if you're just talking about transition or the ability to be visible, right? If you have already marginalizations that are to the forefront, that are visible, you were less likely to use that being out or kind of pushing those boundaries because you already had things that made you unsafe in specific social contexts. Also understanding that poverty decreases the ability for having support. It decreases the ability for having access to clothing options for nonconformity. It decreases the options you have for transitioning and for medical advocacy or advocacy groups in general. The more rural you are, the less likely you are to have specific groups catering towards marginalizations. So really just all of these different intersections that we have and we hold as within our own positionality really impact what coping strategies we can use as we walk through the world. And that's the same for everybody. But this book's really, and what I really want you to look into is this idea that about the different complexities of the lives of these trans kids and the different harms that can come due to lack of support. Because as adults and as we walk through the world as adults, whether it be through being a boss, whether it be through whatever job you're going to have, if you're going to be in, especially if you're going to be in any fields that deals with children, whether that be education, medical, social services, anything of that nature, really, or even just as parents, understanding that we as adult humans can stand with and can be those support structures that create and elude so much positive change in the lives of trans kids, I think makes it invaluable for us to be a part of. So if you have any questions about how to do that or other things, we're going to get into chapter 6 moving into the next lecture, but also just as a human being, if you have any questions or groups you want to get into or ideas on how to be helpful within your field of work, please don't hesitate to pop questions at me. We can have a meeting, we can bounce ideas. There's all sorts of different groups and things you can be a part of to help do this. So let me know how I can help you help everyone. So I will see you in the next lecture. Bye, everybody.